Well, hello, and welcome back to AOPA's Pilot Information Center live stream webinar series. Our topic for this episode is flying in Alaska. I'm Ferdy Mack with AOPA's Pilot Information Center in Frederick, Maryland. Thanks for joining us. This webinar is brought to you by AOPA's Pilot Information Center. We answer more than 200,000 member inquiries every year. If you haven't called us yet, you should give us a call at 1-800-USA-AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. Before we get started with today's content, I'd like to remind our viewers that you can subscribe to this YouTube channel using the red subscribe button just below the video. And you can send us your questions during the live presentation through the chat box just to the right of the video. We will answer the most popular questions at the end of this hour-long presentation. Also, if you are not watching this live, please feel free to contact us with your questions at 800-872-2672, Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Or you can also email us in the Pilot Information Center at pilotassist@aopa.org. Joining me today are Tom Haynes and Tom George. Tom Haynes is AOPA's Senior Vice President and Media and Outreach. And of course, many of you may recognize him as one of our anchors on AOPA Live this week's production. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thanks, Ferdy. It's great to be here. We're going to have a good time tonight, I think, talking about one of the most beautiful places on Earth to fly a general aviation airplane.
Absolutely. We've got some wonderful information. We've got some wonderful imagery. I think it'll be very enjoyable. And also joining us this evening is Tom George. Tom George is AOPA's Regional Manager in Alaska. Hi there, Tom. How are you?
Good evening.
Are we getting him?
Okay.
Yeah. Good evening. I'm with you.
Great, Tom. Glad to hear you. Tom, before we get started with the content this evening, could you tell us a little bit about what your role entails as our regional manager?
Sure. My job as general aviation advocate is to represent our members with a variety of government agencies, everything from the legislature to the FAA to the State Department of Transportation and beyond.
I'm not getting Tom at all.
All right. Great, Tom. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. We do need to get our audio sorted out a little bit, but so we can get started. Tom Haynes, can you give us a little idea of what it's like flying in Alaska?
Sure. You know, it's really an amazing place. We got some video I think we can show you about some of the incredible places there are to do. It's, you know, these broad river valleys. There's incredible ice packs. You can fly over the glaciers, and it's just, you know, visuals that, you know, you would just not see anywhere else in the world. And Tom George, I know that you've been flying up there for a very long time. And in fact, you've got a Cessna 185. That's me flying a Cessna 180 right now that you see there over one of the glaciers in the Copper River Valley. But you've done a lot of that kind of flying in your 185, Tom. How long you had that thing?
I've had that airplane for a better part of 20 years and had the privilege of flying it over a lot of different parts of the state. And you're absolutely right. It's a great place to fly, and in some cases, it's the only way to get around.
Okay, I'm just going to do a little audio adjustment there. It is pretty remarkable. So let's just share with everybody some of the places when they're ready to go up there. We'll talk tonight about some of the routes that you can take on your way to Alaska when you're flying up from the 48 states. And then once you get there, I think people will be surprised about the airspace that is going to be facing you when you get up there. We think it's a big, wide open place, and in fact, there's more airspace to deal with than people might think. Of course, once you get there, though, lots of things to do. National parks that you can fly in that are very GA friendly. The weather, though, can be challenging, and also there's some charts and a lot of other tools and resources that can be useful to you when you get up there. So Tom, let's talk about some of the routes that people might experience on their way to Alaska.
Certainly. Of course, the beauty of an airplane is we can fly almost any direction we want to. We're not confined to the narrow width of a road, but there still are different routes that you want to consider when you're planning a trip up from the western U.S. into Alaska.
It's terrible.
And I think we're looking at about 3 of them here. And in general, we're avoiding the coastal weather, which can often be pretty daunting. And in this case, looking at more interior routes. But even then, you've got some consideration between where you can get gas and how far you can fly and what the weather information available is to you. So if we can look at that in just a little bit more detail, when people, on the next slide, if we can get to that, the yellow line here is actual Alaska highway. And so people talking about flying the Alcan route, that's more or less what they're talking about. But of course, you wouldn't recommend just literally following it every step of the way. And another route that's pretty popular is to fly what's called the trench. That's the middle route here. It has a very long leg from McKenzie to the south up to Watson Lake that's over 340 nautical miles. So you need to make sure that you've got enough weather and fuel to make that leg of the trip. And then there's another option, which is to go west further into Smithers, follow the highway up to Dease Lake, and then cut across country over to Watson Lake.
There you go. And so then you kind of find yourselves up near Yellowknife and get into the interior of Alaska. And there are some routes there once you get into Alaska that you need to be probably following from a terrain standpoint as well, right?
Well, the most common kind of concentration point for people is at Whitehorse. And from Whitehorse, you're liable to cross the border and enter. There's a first port of entry is at Northway. And from there, a lot of people will either follow the valley up to Fairbanks and range out to the north and west, or they'll go to Anchorage. And somewhere in between, they'll probably go up by Denali National Park. And we'll talk about all three of those places before we're done this evening.
Right. But once you get into the sort of the southeastern corner there of Alaska, you begin to run into some rather large military airspace. People might be surprised how much military flying goes on in Alaska. And you just need to be wary of that and need to treat a little bit differently than what you might here in the United States or in the 48.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we have a huge military operations area complex in the central eastern part of the state, and it's over 300 nautical miles across. So you can't just follow the conventional wisdom of going around the MOA if it's active. And the good news here is that the military's worked with us and created a special use airspace information service that allows us to communicate with the military and get real-time information as we're going. And essentially, the way this works is they provided a radio frequency to talk to Eielson range control. And you can announce your position and your intentions, and they'll let you know if there's any military traffic along your route of flight. And in this manner, you can really navigate this airspace with a great deal of ease. There's also a phone number that you can use to listen to a recorded message after hours or to talk to the range controllers real time during the day. And that will let you know whether there are major exercises in the time frame that you're looking at flying through, or whether it's just a light level of activity that would be pretty easy to navigate.
Okay, all good information for people making that trek. One thing that people I think will find perhaps different from flying in the 48 states is that the number of state-owned airports in Alaska, it's a pretty phenomenal number compared to what we typically see down here. There's a handful of states that own some airports, but in Alaska it's a very common thing. So what should people expect?
Well, you've once again hit the nail on the head. What we're looking at here is the skinny little black lines represent almost the entire road network for the state of Alaska. And in contrast, the yellow dots are the state-operated airports, and then black dots are other municipally operated airports. And so it's pretty apparent that if you want to get to 82% of the communities in the state of Alaska, you need to get into an airplane.
Yeah, you certainly do, because it's certainly vast distances to cover, and those those yellow dots really, or the black ones too, really represent the access to so many of those places. There's just no other way to get there. But surprisingly, my experience in flying into a few of the state airports is that they're actually pretty nice facilities, at least from a runway standpoint. Typically maybe packed gravel. There are some dirt ones I know, and obviously some paved ones as well. But important point to remember is you're not going to find your typical FBO that you might find in the lower 48. And fuel is also a consideration. It's just not available on every corner like we're used to down here.
Yeah, Albuquerque here is a good example where they've got a great 4,000-foot runway, but once you land, you're on your own, and you need to be prepared, including having enough fuel to go wherever you're going to go next.
So those of us with some gray hair, you a little more than me, but nonetheless, I've got some too. Well, remember when flight service used to be a place on the airport where you went and talked to a guy in the usually a windowless office for some reason to get the latest weather brief. And here in the lower 48, we don't have that anymore. We've got automated flight service, and we call some guy in a distant place somewhere and talk to them and get a briefing, and it works okay. But in Alaska, there still are some more traditional flight service stations. Is that right?
Yes, a big difference for people that are not used to flying here is that the FAA still operates the flight service stations. We have undergone some changes from the good old days, but there are 3 stations that are 24 hours a day. That's Fairbanks, Kenai, and Juneau. However, we still have 14 what they're called satellite stations that are either part-time or seasonal. And these stations you can walk into, they do have windows and they have people inside that can tell you how to get by in the local area and what kind of weather to expect. So that's a resource we'd certainly encourage people to take advantage of, either on the phone, by the radio, or walking in the door.
Yeah, the local knowledge can really be helpful in flying, and particularly in that kind of environment when you're not used to the area and don't know the terrain and the weather patterns so well. They can be a great resource. But hey, enough of the kind of technical side of what it takes to get there. Let's talk a little about what the amazing things you can do when you get there, including an event that was just held this past weekend. The Great Alaska Aviation Gathering is a really famous aviation event in Anchorage. I've been there. It's a really wonderful event that occurs in an enormous hangar at Anchorage. You were there this weekend, I assume, Tom?
Yes, the Airmen's pulled it off again and had probably over 20,000 people that stopped in over the period of the 2 days. And that's a routine event on the first weekend of May. The second weekend of May is the Valdez Fly-In, which is a different type of a fly-in, short field contest, tail dragger airplane event. And there are numerous other things around the state, but I'd talk about just one more, the Minchumina rock skipping contest. So if you're around near the end of July, this is a location about 150 miles west of or southwest of Fairbanks. And people fly in here to spend a day to see who can skip a rock the furthest and take home a big prize. And the biggest rule is that you can't bring your own rocks.
Use supplied rocks only. I get it. That's got to be important. Yeah, so that sounds like quite a feat. Fun place to fly in, I'm sure. But you've done some really cool stuff, cool flying up there. We've got a shot of you with the Beaver standing on the floats there. Tell me about this trip and how it is you got there, and where are you?
Well, I'd like to claim that I flew into here, but in this case, a group of us flew our wheel-equipped airplanes to Bettles on the south side of the Brooks Range, and we chartered with a local operator who flew the crew plus gear into this lake called the Hunt Fork on the John River, inflated our various boats, and spent the next 6 days floating south through the Brooks Range. And so one thing to keep in mind is you can extend your aeronautical reach by taking advantage of other people that are based there, whether they're friends or commercial operators or anybody whose arm you can twist.
Well, my experience with folks in Alaska, it doesn't take much arm twisting, though, to get them to go flying. I know easy when I'm there with you to just give any kind of a hint of let's go flying, and you're all over it.
Sounds like a great place to be as a pilot. I'd like to interject and let our viewers know, especially if you've joined us since we started, we are answering Q&A this evening.
Okay.
So if you would like to jump into the chat on the right-hand side of the window, I'm taking a look at it here, and we're going to collect the questions as we go and bundle them up and answer them in a short segment at the end of the production. However, if we get something timely in the middle of our discussion here, we might interject it as well. So get creative, ask us your questions, and we'll do our best to get them answered.
All right, thanks. So speaking of access and using general aviation airplanes to get around the state, of course, hunting and fishing is a really big deal in Alaska, and airplanes play a big role in that as well.
Yeah, so earlier we talked about the airports, but if you're properly equipped, of course, a much larger percentage of the state's available to you. And there are plenty of people that go land on gravel bars and hillsides and other places to get access for all kinds of reasons, but hunting and fishing is certainly some of the more popular ones. And that goes to other seasons of the year as well. You can cover the ground even with a little bit of snow on it. In this case, we're looking at a bench on the north side of the Brooks Range, and we were probably the only people that were there all day.
That must be quite an experience. And then you can also experience things like flying a mall on floats off the dock here. That looks really picturesque. Is that some flying you did?
Well, the credit for this goes to Adam White with the Alaska Airmen's Association. So yeah, float planes are another form of access that get people out to the remote area, either to their recreational cabins or the network of people that actually live off the grid in the state. And of course, you can swap your floats for skis in the wintertime and continue just with a different form of landing gear.
All right, so airplanes up there are sort of all-season vehicles, I gather.
Absolutely.
So down here, when we think about going to national parks, an awful lot of them are not really very general aviation friendly. It's difficult to land in many of them. A few of them have some strips you can get into, and we know about noise issues over many of them. But in Alaska, the national park system is huge, and it also is generally pretty welcoming of general aviation. I know I've flown over in Wrangell, St. Elias a little bit, and it's the size of Yosemite, Yellowstone, and the country of Switzerland all blended together, just to give you a sense of size. And it's just an incredible part of the state to fly in. And there's lots of access to national parks up there, right, Tom?
Well, you were in Wrangell, St. Elias, which is the largest park in the entire park system. And a little fun fact is that over half of the national park acreage is in the state of Alaska.
Oh, no, you're just bragging now, Tom.
Oh, sorry about that.
So go ahead. Sorry about that. Lots of opportunities to fly, though, in the state, in the parks.
And of course, probably the best known park in the state is Denali National Park. And actually, we'll dig into that one a little bit deeper.
We will. And one of the primary access points, particularly if you're going with some of the flight seeing operations around Denali, is Talkeetna. And that's an incredible airport with a remarkable amount of traffic in the summertime, but really a fun place to fly out of as well.
Yeah, and we had the AOPA crew here just yesterday, and we're blessed with good enough weather to get back into Denali National Park and back to one of your favorite glaciers.
Yeah, that's right. You and I had the chance to fly up there a couple of years ago. Maybe it's been about 5 years ago now, I think. Flew into Talkeetna and then flew up onto the mountain, landed at the base camp there in a turbine otter. And looks like, as I recall, we had a fantastic day. We got to fly the whole way around Denali, which I understand you don't always get to fly around on the north side because the weather can be a little challenging from times. But we had a remarkable day and got some great shots out on the glacier. There's Tom with the base camp in the background. Tell us a little bit about what's going on back there, Tom.
Well, I'm pleased to say that the park is still there, and we were actually back in the Kahiltna yesterday. Not quite as nice a weather as we experienced, and we probably would have not made it to the north side. But we went in with a load of gear and some people that were dropped off there that we're going to spend the next week or two. And this is the point of departure for almost 1,200 people a year that have their shot at climbing the mountain. And it's both the last place they see civilization and probably a very welcome place to come back to.
And so, how many of them actually make it?
Oh, something like 60% of them actually make the summit. And fortunately, most of the rest of them also make it back down to the base camp.
All right, so it was a remarkable day that we spent up there. That I'm getting the suntan there, and that is the picture you just saw me standing there. That is the actually Denali, the peak of Denali behind us, and you can see a lot of activity on the ground at the base camp. It's a busy place. You'd think up on the side of a mountain somewhere that there wouldn't be much activity, but all around Denali there's really a lot of activity going on, particularly in the summertime. And in fact, the FAA has created some charts that are special for the Denali area to help pilots out, and there's some detail there that people ought to be familiar with before they fly in that area.
So if you are going to fly around this area, first of all, make sure you're comfortable with mountain flying procedures, because these are some serious mountains and the weather can be very changeable. But yeah, the Park Service, the FAA, and the Alaska Aviation Safety Foundation all conspired to make a chart to help people navigate this area. They've created some mountain frequencies, which are essentially, again, are common traffic advisory frequencies. And they've also put a rich description of VFR reporting points, which they can use as they're flying along to identify where they are and where they're going next. And so this is a great tool for situational awareness, because there's this tendency to think that you're the only person there, and sometimes that's just not the case.
Right. So the next slide shows a little bit more detail of some of those procedures. So if you fly up there, you want to make sure you get your hands on it and look at what you need to get around there. But Tom, you mentioned weather. That's a good point. We need to spend a little bit of time this evening talking about what weather people might expect to come across in Alaska. There's certainly some unique weather challenges because of the terrain and obviously the vast distances. The FAA and NOAA and National Weather Service have created some unique products specifically for Alaska. But one of the challenges is that there are a lot of weather reporting stations, but given the size of the state, it's not all that many. It looks like a lot on that shot we got there now, but there's big mass distances between those points.
Yes, we have to characterize Alaska as a weather poor state. And if you just looked at the map of surface reporting points, you might tend to think that the weather was pretty good on the coast with just a few fog patches. But if you then add a satellite image to the equation, you can see that fog on the coast actually covers inland a better part of 100 miles. And yet there are no weather reporting stations in there to give you a clue. So you really have to use all the tools available to figure out what the weather's like before you take off on a big cross-country expedition.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to interject a question here, which I think will lead right into where we're going. Rudy Spit asks, how prevalent are airport webcams, and do you use them for checking local weather? Are any pointed at passes, ridges, et cetera? And I think, Tom, George, you can tell us it's not just airport webcams that we can rely on, right?
Well, we have a whole system of weather cameras, and actually we're going to talk about those in detail for just a minute. So if I could defer that question, I think we'll be able to cover it a little more comprehensive in a couple of slides.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit, they've got their own weather pages from NOAA with lots of great information as well.
Yeah, the Weather Service has acknowledged that our situation is a little different from the rest of the country and actually assembled a team of forecasters at the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit. And one of the things that they do is keep up a page, or actually a whole site, with a variety of forecasts, current conditions. And I just learned at a meeting today that this website actually will be updated over the next couple of months. So its appearance may change, but it should still be an excellent resource for people to plan their trips in the state of Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this is just an example of some of the graphic forecasts they give, giving the VFR, IFR conditions, and they break these down into several segments over a 12-hour period, so you can get an idea of how the weather's about to change.
But just as flying anywhere else in the country, PIREPs are an important part of the weather picture, helping pilots understand what's actually going on in the atmosphere, as opposed to what the forecast might have said. And they have a lot of need for PIREPs and a kind of a special program going on right now in Alaska. Is that right?
Well, PIREPs are part of how we're helping fill the gaps with between our few weather reporting stations. And so one of the things that the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit does is give us a graphic ability to look at pilot reports. And we're constantly encouraging people to provide more as they fly.
So, Ferdy, you mentioned the weather cam. So we now have a slide that shows some of the weather cameras that are scattered around Alaska. And you're right, they can be really helpful. But they're not just at airports, as you mentioned. They're also in passes and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this program has probably been the most popular thing the FAA's done in years. And we're up to something over 220 locations around the state that have a complex of cameras, anywhere from 2 to 4 cameras per site, that update every 10 minutes. And so we can pull these up as long as we have internet access and get a better idea of what the weather actually is looking like at that location. And the display we're seeing here is pretty typical, with the current conditions on the left and a clear day image, or relatively clear day image, on the right, that's annotated with a few landmarks that will help you calibrate what you're seeing in the current image. There's also a video loop that will allow you to play the last 6 hours of observations, which is very helpful in terms of figuring out whether the weather is improving or deteriorating or staying the same.
Wow, looks like a really good use of the cameras, and really interesting way to help pilots orient themselves with weather and the weather's impact on terrain as well. So what's the best time to come to Alaska, and how long are the summers?
Well, that's an excellent challenge for us all. Summer, by definition, is pretty short. So June through August are pretty much identified as the summer months. In contrast to that, the driest month in many parts of the state range kind of from April to June. So it's a little drier earlier in the season. And then finally, we do fly airplanes all year round, but the winter conditions are just a little bit more challenging. So you need to be prepared for things like wing covers, engine blankets, and preheating equipment if you're going to plan to operate in the winter.
Yeah, I sense maybe there's a little bit of understatement there about can be a little more challenging, but maybe not. But I will confirm, though, when I was flying up there in August a year and a half ago, that it rained like crazy one day. So you're right, it's wetter than earlier in the summer. And then this was like kind of the end of the third week of August. And by the time we left, there was about 3 inches of snow on the ground. So the termination dust had arrived. That's what they call the first snow of the season, terminating the summer weather. But it was still a beautiful day once the snow quit. It was really nice to be out and about. It wasn't all that cold, but the snow made everything look completely different than it had 12 hours earlier. It was pretty interesting.
If I can get a question,
the change can be pretty quick.
Yes, it can.
If I can get a question in here, we got Mark in Texas, new pilot. How can I learn to fly in Alaska? Mountain flying is new to me. Do you have any examples or experiential information that we could share with him? You know, I mean, it's one thing as an instructor to approach how do I learn how to do mountain flying, but you know, when you apply it to a specific region in Alaska, right, plus it's so varied,
yep,
plus the challenges of winter versus summer, that's a tough one.
Well, I'm sure there are flight instructors and flight schools up there that specialize in helping pilots. Tom, do you have any examples of those kind of operations that specialize in mountain flying?
There are some specialty operations. In general, though, I think your best advice is whatever part of the state you're in, to try and find some pilots in the local area and ask their advice on how to go certain places and deal with specific local conditions. And because the state's large enough, and again, not to be accused of bragging, but we've got probably 5 different climatic regions that are all very different, ranging from rainforest in southeast Alaska to a tundra desert environment on the North Slope and a few mountainous ranges in between. And each of them has their own special techniques, and far be it from any one of us to think that we could be experts on the whole thing.
Yeah, good point. I know when I was flying in the Copper River Valley there, I hooked up with quite a number of local pilots, and they were really helpful. We went flying together a couple of days, and then a couple of other days they sort of gave us a good briefing on what we should expect. We were flying out over some of the glaciers, and we went off on our own, but it was great having that local knowledge. So I guess I can't stress that enough, is hook up with some local pilots, and they seem to be very generous with their knowledge, and so it's really quite helpful. But another resource in Alaska, just down here, is the chart supplement. And Alaska's got one of its own.
Yeah, the chart supplement in Alaska is even a different color, just to set it off a little bit. And beyond the normal airport directory, facility directory information you get in the front of the book, there is a notices section that is filled with a bunch of specific information, CTAF frequencies, the system I mentioned over the Denali National Park, the military airspace system, and a bunch more. So it would really be worthwhile to spend some time browsing that notices section to figure out some of the specific differences and services available to you. Mm-hmm. And I also want to point out that, and this has been a question that's come up from people I've talked to in various parts of the country, 406 megahertz ELTs are not currently required to fly through Canada, so don't let that be a reason not to head north.
Good point. So earlier you mentioned, we were talking about Denali, I think it was, you mentioned about the use of CTAF frequencies, and that's actually fairly common, and the FAA has assigned CTAFs where we typically think of them just being particular to one airport down here. They're used for reporting in various large parts of Alaska. Is that right?
Yes, the FAA recognized that we had some unique circumstances, especially even here north of Anchorage, but in other parts of the state as well. So they've actually redefined the CTAFs in the state of Alaska only that can cover an area rather than just the 10-mile radius around an airport or a landing area. And in the Mat-Su Valley, north of Anchorage, they've assigned several of these areas and made some special charts that allow you to not only know what frequency to be on, but to provide some reporting points that you can use to indicate where you are and where you're headed to help maintain situational awareness.
And speaking of special charts, Juneau has one. That's an unusual place to fly into. It's, as I recall, it's landlocked. There really isn't any way to get there except by airplane or boat.
Or
right?
ferry.
Ferry, yeah. So they have a special VFR chart there as well.
And in this case, this is an actual inset on the sectional chart.
Ah, okay.
But again, it breaks out some specific CTAF areas and also shows you some of the IFR routes that you're liable to have Alaska Airlines 737s descending out of the clouds. And so again, this is very helpful to folks flying in those areas to keep track of what's happening around them.
Mm-hmm. And Anchorage also presents its own unique traffic situations, because in the summertime, there's a lot of traffic at Lake Hood as well as at the main airport, and so you better beware.
Yes, even here at Anchorage International Airport, you've got a Super Cub on floats taking off not all that far away from a heavy 747 coming in from Asia and everything in between. So there are actual Part 93 airspaces that are regulatory airspaces that are defined to help people get in and out of the different airports. The FAA's done a nice job of laying out some VFR departure and arrival procedures. These, again, will be found in the notices section of the Alaska Chart Supplement. And it really pays to study these before you come in and become familiar with the specific route that you want to use. Now, that said, ATC is very helpful. And so in addition to looking at these, I would identify to ATC that you're unfamiliar with the area, and they will give you all the help you need to get where you're going.
Right, just like back when we were student pilots and we fessed up that we needed a little extra help, and it's nice to hear the controllers up there are helpful as well. So it's a great place to fly, just you have a little bit of homework to do because it is an unusual place to fly with some weather challenges, terrain challenges, and vast distances to be covered. So take advantage of some of the resources we talked about here. As Tom pointed out, we've got some great resources on our website. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk about this evening, share some of the experiences that Tom has had. And now, Ferdy, what do we got in the way of questions?
All right. Well, thanks, guys. First of all, I'm going to toss up here. A couple people want to know about using ForeFlight in Canada. In particular, I would guess I frame the question as, is ForeFlight as useful as far as what chart products are available in Alaska as they are down here in the lower 48?
I know there's a separate subscription for ForeFlight for Canadian charts, so you will have to buy that, but it's pretty seamless. You can do that through the app itself, as I recall. And I guess I've never used it in Alaska. Tom, are you aware? I presume that all the Alaska charts are in ForeFlight just as everywhere else, right?
There are many people that use ForeFlight. I don't personally use it, but I know plenty of folks that do, and they love it a lot.
Yep. Okay, so it's a great resource too.
So actually, when I framed the question, I guess I was muddling two things. One is the Canadian data for overflight or fuel stops, and then the separate question of, do we get Alaska coverage already with maybe an existing package, or is that something else that has to be added on?
I think if you buy the U.S. package subscription for ForeFlight, you get Alaska, but there is a separate subscription for Canada.
Right, and that actually leads us to, pardon me, some other good questions about Canada. Matt Smith wants to know, do you need to clear customs in Canada if we're taking the routes that we highlighted earlier in the program, if you're only stopping for fuel? So obviously, if you're going to touch the ground in Canada, they're going to want to know who you are, when you're going to be here, what you're doing here,
right? Just
like we do here in the States.
I've actually never flown to Alaska via Canada, and so I know in some countries you can do a technical stop where you don't actually have to clear customs if you're not leaving the airport. Tom, do you know what the situation is in Alaska?
Yeah, you're going to need to clear customs.
There you go.
And it's very important to remember this is a two-stage process in this day and age. You first of all need to file an AOPA report saying that you're leaving the country, and then you need to call whatever Canadian port of entry that you're going to arrive at and schedule and arrange your arrival. And the same thing is true when you're then re-entering the U.S., leaving Canada, coming into Alaska. File the AOPA report and then call the customs facility that you're going to clear with. And an important distinction is that there are some stations that are available for service 24 hours a day, but you must call during their duty hours to arrange for the after hours arrival. So do your homework on that and don't get caught out.
Okay, good advice.
Okay, great. And I'm glad you brought up the notion that it's not just filing a flight plan, being in contact with ATC, and letting customs know of your plan, but it's also the AOPA system for crossing the international borders. Peter, we plan to overfly Canada on a route from Seattle to Ketchikan. Do we need to pre-register with Canadian ATC to utilize their services? Anything we need to know about ATC?
I I think if you're on an IFR flight, I'm pretty sure if you're on an IFR flight plan, you just go, which on a leg like that, I presume they would be. And if they're asking about air traffic services, then it's pretty seamless. But again, don't forget to do the other parts. Well, actually, I guess if you're right, if you're not touching down in Canada, you don't have to do the whole AOPA thing, but you do. The Canadian services are pretty seamless with the United States. You just file and go.
Right. Tom, anything to add there?
No, that's it. You don't have to make any special arrangements to use them. You will get a bill in the mail later, but it'll be minor.
Yep. I think a few years ago I had it memorized. It was something like $27.50 for a smaller single piston for any ATC services used in Canada per quarter. I think that rate's gone up a little bit, so don't quote me on it. We do have that information on our Canadian travel page on our flight planning website. So we talked a little. While we're on the subject of getting there, one more question. Tom, George, I think we talked about this in our rehearsal, but I don't know if we addressed it here on the live version. Why not fly up the coastal route? A member says, I did it once and it was spectacular.
And if you're fortunate enough to get good weather, by all means, go for it. I've never been fortunate enough to find that condition, and the conditions along the coast can be pretty rugged with not a lot of options if things are going south. So yes, people do it. Definitely do your homework very carefully and check the weather very carefully before you take off on that route of flight.
Yep, terrain along the coast is spectacular, but boy, it's the mountains come right up out of the water, and there's just not a lot of options should you have a problem.
All right, great.
In some places.
Right.
Many places.
Tell us a little bit about just overall, on average, what it's like to fly there as far as altitude in particular. Dan Valley asks us, I used to have a turbocharged aircraft, but I do not any longer. What about safe altitudes for traveling to Alaska and while there? What kind of performance are we going to need?
You can get around just fine in a normally aspirated airplane. You just, like flying in the Rockies, you just need to be aware of the passes and that sort of thing, but there's vast parts of Alaska where the altitudes really aren't that high, and a normally aspirated airplane does just fine. You get around in your 185 really well, Tom, right? With
no difficulty. Yeah, a lot of Alaska is pretty low elevation-wise, and generally we have good passes through the mountains. If you're going to try and go just straight over the mountains at any point, you're going to have to climb for some altitude. But yeah, altitude generally isn't really a problem for the most part.
Okay. What about fuel availability and costs? And while we're on that, Tom, can you also hit cash or credit? Is one preferred? Should I expect to bring more or less of one?
Well, most places do accept credit cards. I would certainly not go into the rural areas without a supply of cash with me as a backup. But I've certainly been able to use credit cards in almost all the places that I've gone to in the state.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Fuel prices.
Yeah, fuel prices.
Fueling stations are few and far between. That's another place you really want to do your homework. And I mean, the larger communities, there'll be no problem. But if you go to the more rural areas and a lot of the state airports that are in the smaller communities, there may be no fuel whatsoever. So I would both look and see what it says in the facilities directory, but also it might be worth making a phone call to make sure that the pumps are really active. Prices vary. They're what are pretty reasonable in the bigger community, and it gets expensive the further away you get. But at that point, you don't care. It's just, I'd like to have the fuel, and it doesn't matter how much it costs.
And you make a good point. You know, in this internet day and age, I think we're all a little less inclined to pick up the phone than we were 10 or 20 years ago, but you're recommending make a phone call, and that's probably the best absolute way to nail down where, when, and how much fuel can I get. Okay,
Absolutely.
Great. Some might view fuel as part of our survival gear, but what other survival gear do we need to focus on in particular for Alaska, depending on how far north we're going and time of year?
Well, that could be the subject of an entire session all on its own. But let's break it down a little bit. The real basic survival gear is often the stuff that is on your person, either in your pockets, a small backpack, or a vest is a very common way to carry it. And that's stuff like signaling devices, shelter, perhaps a little bit of food, fire starting materials, etc. And now most of us in the back of the airplane carry what would be called camping gear, sleeping bags, tents, and things that if we can get to them, will be quite comfortable. And now you have to moderate that with what part of the state you're headed to. If you're going to the North Slope in the middle of the winter, you're going to be wearing a lot of heavy duty parka, insulated pants, and boots. In Southeast, you want your heavy duty rain gear. And in all places, you want mosquito repellent in the summertime.
Good point. Did we talk about guns? I know that casually we've been talking about here, but I don't know on this recording whether we talked about guns or not. What's the rules there?
Well, guns are certainly no problem in the state of Alaska, but the Canadians are pretty picky about what guns go through their country. Handguns are definitely a no-no. Longer rifles can go, but you really need to do some homework to find out what kind of registration requirements. They have links on how short the barrels can be, etc. So if you're going to bring guns, go on the Canadian websites and or call them on the phone and make sure that you're not in for a surprise when you arrive in the country.
Okay, great advice.
All right, so let's say that the airplane that I might bring to Alaska might not be the one I want to fly that day. Maybe I flew up in a wheel plane and I want to fly on floats or skis, or God forbid, let's say I elect to go via airline to save a little time and money maybe, but then still be able to enjoy some of the wonders of general aviation in Alaska. Can either of you tell us a little bit about, this question was started by saying, is it easy to rent a plane in Alaska? And then I was thinking, well, some of the facets there might be availability of GA aircraft to rent. What are the checkouts like? Are there insurance considerations? What are the costs? So can you give us a little commentary on what it's like if I show up with my credit card in hand and say I want to fly that airplane?
That's a question for you, Tom. I know that there was a point when I checked in at Palmer, for example. In Palmer, Alaska, there was an airplane, I think a 172, available for rent there. The last time I looked, it didn't appear that it was still available, but it's probably worth a call. Tom, what about Anchorage area, Fairbanks? Is there any chance you could get an airplane there?
I think there are chances, but they're limited. It's certainly much more difficult today than it was 20 years ago to just walk in the door of a flight school or a different company and rent an aircraft. So that's another thing that you are going to have to do some homework in advance. There are rentals available in the larger communities, but they're a little more challenging to get to than they have been in years past.
Okay. So kind of what we're experiencing here. It's not as easy to rent airplanes in the 48 as it used to be either.
Yeah. There are a few more empty spots out there on the ramp than there were 10 years ago, but they're still there.
They are.
Thankfully. All right, well, gentlemen, I think you've done a wonderful job giving us some great commentary, some great imagery, some great things to think about. We can't possibly cover everything in just an hour like this. So, the two of the best resources that everyone out there is going to have is contacting us and going to our website. So, guys, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite places to fly, and it's always enjoyable to go to Alaska, that's for sure. It's a great place to use a general aviation airplane because there are so many places to go that you can't get there any other way.
And I'd like to encourage you to all make a flight plan and come on up and visit.
Sign me up.
If my fuel tanks were big enough, yeah, that'd be great. So to all of you out there joining us online on YouTube, if you have any aviation-related questions, either pertaining to flying in Alaska or any other such topics, as part of your AOPA membership, you can contact our PIC staff here Monday through Friday at 800-USA-AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. Or you can email your questions to us at pilotassist@aopa.org. Also, please do subscribe to this YouTube channel using the red subscribe button just below the video. And don't forget to check out our website with everything else at www.aopa.org. Thanks for joining us.